So I'm just filling in and didn't have time to construct something new, so I'm going to rehash a talk which I gave last year on the occasion of Shannon's 100th birth anniversary. And this is not a textbook talk. It's more of a motivational talk, which I hope will prompt you to think about the same problems from a different viewpoint. And the viewpoint which I'm going to emphasize is actually the dynamics of waves and how it influences information theory and the concepts which we have built in the structure of Boolean logic. Waves are not described by Boolean logic, they are different ingredients, and they, although familiar, will give new directions in which we should look at information. And that is the sense in which I'm going to talk about. I will get to the mathematics and details of what we call quantum information later on. But first I want to give an intuitive feeling about what we mean by information and what we would like to do with that. So I start with my definition of what is a computation. And computation is essentially dynamics of information. A static information is of little use, and we want to manipulate it, transform it from one form to another, make some part more visible than they were earlier. And all those things form a part of computation, and it can be mapped to physical processes in a very general sense. And physical processes, typically we think of as some initial state, some interactions, and then reaches some final state. And computers behave in a similar way, some input, some processing, and some output. And in general, we can perform a mapping, provided we can interpret what we call interactions as some kind of processing, but that processing, the jump from one language to another, is that this is intentional, it is meaningful. It's no longer something which is happening automatically by natural forces, we are going to control it. And if you do that, then we put a purpose in this particular process, it's all intentional, and that we'll call a computation. And in this mapping, we convert the physics, which is the hardware inside this framework, to software, which is buried inside here. It's a change of terminology, but a useful change. However, a restriction always remains in the sense that what we can do and what we cannot do will be dictated by the type of physical interactions that exist. Mathematically, we can certainly define lots of operations, but not all of them can be mapped to a physical process, and then we will not worry about it. And if we change the rules about what are the interactions that we are going to use to do certain kind of processing, then of course we'll change the type of computer which we are going to construct. And in this context, I can mention that communication is a rather special case which Shannon dealt with in particular, where the processing is limited to initial coding and final decoding. In between, rather, nothing much happens. Okay, so how we make use of this kind of framework, that we want to design a computer that will manipulate the information which is buried inside the physical data, and that context is expressed by what we call a language. So information is rather abstract thing, but a language provides it the context or its meaning about what that information contains. And depending on many type of physical processes that exist, we can construct many different kind of information and many kind of processing system. The question remains that can we construct a broad enough framework which will cover all kind of different possibilities? And I'm going to outline my understanding of what can be done. Essentially, the final question will be that how can I design a computer, an optimal computer for a particular given task, and the optimization will require some extra features in mathematics. Typically, it contains two features: minimization of resources and control of errors. And these criteria often conflict. You have to have some trade-offs, and depending on what you want to trade off against what, we'll have different information processing systems. But very general grounds say that the resources are minimized when we make our system highly versatile, what we can call general purpose computers. It can deal with many different things. And control of errors almost invariably requires digitization of the variables. If you have continuous variables, there is no way to control errors. And the two parts which I mentioned will be interlinked. Software will focus on what is the task, what is the algorithm. Hardware will focus on how are you going to implement the processes. And the overall efficiency of the whole process will depend on what is available in both these domains. You cannot talk about efficiency by just focusing on one or the other. That is not complete. So let me define the technical terms which I'm going to use. First, there is a physical data, which describes a particular realization of a physical system among its many possibilities. Information is an abstract mathematical property which converts this data to something which has no reference to the data. All the physical characteristics are gone. In the computers, everything becomes 0 and 1. And where the 0 and 1 came from, we hardly have to worry about. It can come from some arithmetic computation, it can be a word processor output, it can be an audio file, it can be a picture and a video. Doesn't matter, computer can handle all of it. And this is something which is related to what Eugene Wigner called unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Why can we do such a separation that we can abstract out all the mathematics from a physical system and then do a lot of things? It's a fact of life, whether by design or fluke, I will not worry about, but as long as it is existing, I can certainly use it. At the end of it, I have to put back the sense of purpose in this abstract mathematical structure, and then we'll have something which we can call knowledge, putting the meaning back inside the abstract sets of zeros and ones. And so I have a couple of equations. The information is physical data minus its realization, and knowledge is information plus its interpretation. The realization and interpretation of the physical part, while the information is the mathematical part. And a computer will be a block diagonal structure like this. Data comes in and some knowledge came out. In between, the separation goes on. You have all the manipulations and instructions. So let me just reiterate the important physical parts of it, which I'm going to detach, but which will remain in the background all the time. And that is that abstract information can be manipulated by mathematical rules without going into its origin or meaning. It's tremendously useful. Manipulations can only be implemented using physical devices. So the physics puts restrictions, and then the interpretation also needs restrictions from physics. And these hardware properties, they govern basically what we can call the expression or the grammar of the language. And that's why the language is little more than information. It is the background context which we have to keep in mind. The abstract information theory will not tell you anything about the physical realization, what is the best choice, or what is the best way of carrying out a task. That will depend on the type of information and not the amount of information. And that I will come back, or that gives a possibility of what are the kind of computers we can construct. And let me give a simple example which contrasts two widely differing technology. So this is an example of real life. A plant attracts an insect to its flower. It has a purpose, pollination for the plant and food for the insect. And the task which is required is convey the existence, direction, and distance the insect has to travel. Where are these features buried? The existence is buried inside this structure of molecules of fragrance. Every flower will have its own characteristic signal, and the insect is able to detect that molecule using a mechanism which molecular biologists call it lock and key. Everything has a different shape, and it latches on. The direction is buried inside the concentration gradients of these molecules. The insect will follow the direction in which the concentration increases. And the distance is inferred from the overall concentration of the molecules. When you are close to the flowers, the concentration will reach some kind of a saturation value. How did this language arise? By millions of years of co-evolution, and it is buried in the genes. We don't know how really it works, but it works. And the resources are massively redundant communication process. There is not one molecule. There are huge number of molecules the flower is throwing out, and it's optimized by going down all the way to the atomic scale. The molecules, because they are required in large number, you try to make it small and small so that the plant doesn't waste too much physical resources on it. Now contrast this with how we have solved these problems using mobile phones. They convey essentially similar feature, existence, direction, and distance, but using different schemes. The existence is followed by a signal which is transmitted as waves. It's actually a two-way communication. This thing is one-way communication, but I will gloss over it. And the direction and distance are not detected by this kind of concentration gradient. We use something else which is called GPS. So you can have very different physical realizations solving essentially the same problem. Depends on the context, what you want to focus on, what is available, what is not available, how sophisticated your machinery is, etc. And so let me now take the next step, is that we don't want to just accomplish the task, but we want to optimize it. And this requires a certain mathematical description. How can you design a language which for a given information processing task is also optimal? And generically, it leads to a structure which I call a minimal language. What is minimal language? It means that it's the language with the smallest set of building blocks that can accomplish a particular task. Why is the smallest set advantageous? The first thing is it has largest tolerance against errors. If there are too many different possibilities, we are likely to confuse them with each other because they might overlap in certain properties. But if there are small number, the possibility of confusion is less. And this is such an advantage that we actually end up converting even continuous variables to discrete variables of a small number. This is what is done, for example, in the electronic circuits. What actually physically exists are currents and voltages. But you don't want to use the complete continuous range of currents and voltages. You put at the extreme value, either it is off or on. Not a real number, but just a bunch of integers. And when you do that, what you do is assign a particular variable, not to a particular point or a discrete value, but a range or an interval of values is assigned a particular meaning. So 0 is not particular value of voltage, it is a range of voltages, which is all called 0. Similarly, there will be a whole range of voltages, which is called a 1. All we have to make sure is these two don't overlap. And as long as there is no overlap, there is no confusion, there can be fluctuations within that range, which are bound to happen in any physical device, but those fluctuations do not change the meaning. That is the essential part. So we control errors, and this is a concept which is called bounded error computation. That there can be errors as long as they are bounded, the digital language will eliminate them. And this is not our own inventions. It is so basic that it is buried all the way down to our genes. The genetic language went digital. We don't know how, but it did, and that plays a very important role in controlling errors. If there were not discrete letters like A, C, G, T, there was some continuous concentration of chemicals, there will be a terrible mass, and the required processing of information won't work. So there is an advantage, tremendous advantage. Other things which go with that, if you have a very small number of variables, the instruction set simplifies rather drastically. So we have the binary arithmetic in this electronic circuit. It has only two variables, 0 and 1. And you can do everything, all arithmetic with this using only two operations. What are they? One of them is a NOT, and another is AND. So AND will do the multiplication for you, and if you want combine them with other one, addition is exclusive OR. So it's NOT plus AND. And with these two simple logic operations, you can do everything. But that is possible because we went all the way down to 0 and 1. If we had stuck to our digital language, then just like what we did in our primary school, we had to memorize multiplication table. 5 times 7 is 35. Well, we put it in our mind and keep it all throughout, but we need a larger table. In binary logic, the table became very small. And so the physical implementation became very simple. There are other features which are connected with this thing. If you make these things very compact, you can simplify it, make the things rather small, and the operations can become quick. The language without too many variables also will require very little machinery for translation. And as I said, the Boolean algebra is the minimal classical language for encoding information, and this is the structure in which it encodes. It's a one-dimensional sequence of letters. And that is what we use all the time. And this framework allows you to now ask, can we go beyond Boolean algebra? Can we design other kind of structures? There will be a different set of minimal languages, but they will encode different sets of things. And for that purpose, I'm going to change the definition of language from a sequence of letters to a collection of building blocks. And this is a simple enough generalization, but it immediately extends the scopes of what we can do. The collection means that the building blocks can be arranged in space-time in many different ways. The building blocks will be described in terms of the physical properties, and mathematically they can be encoded using structure of groups. And processing are the transformations which are again connected with the properties of the groups, and which will tell you what you can do or cannot do in terms of manipulating the information. And group theory is very useful for the description in this structure. The minimal language will correspond to using the smallest discrete group in this particular structure. The digitization will mean that the group will be truncated in a certain way, and that truncation can describe in different ways. One way is to replace the group manifold by a simplex. For a d-dimensional space, it is a set of d+1 points. And another way, which is a dual language, is to take the group and choose its smallest two representations. One of them is a trivial identity representation, but the other one is a non-trivial fundamental representation. But you need two of these features. Either of these two languages are good enough to describe them, and then the machinery will be either a single simplex or these two representations that will form a one particular choice of a letter, and will construct the letter by putting all the simplices together to construct larger structures for the words and sentences of the language. And an example for the Boolean logic is what we call a place value system for numbers. There are the same zeros and ones, but depending on its location, the value we associate with that is different. And mathematically, this place value system is something called a tensor product. Okay, so let me start with the possibilities. The simplest possibility of type of collection is zero dimension. What is zero dimension? It's actually a point. And what is a zero dimensional collection? It means having multiple signals at the same point at the same time. Sounds a little bit weird, but this is precisely the property of superposition in case of waves. There can be multiple contributions, but they are all sitting at the same point, and we see some combined effect of all these contributions. So superposition is a zero-dimensional collection, and it can represent many things, but one restriction that when you want to look at the final result, you will get one signal out. You can choose what signal you want to extract, but you will only get one, not all of them at one go. And the examples which we have used for waves are this radio, broadcast, mobile phones, all the signals are there simultaneously. But you can select one of them and listen to it. The other ones are off by default, but all of them are there, and you can select whatever you want from the collection. The next one is more familiar, the one-dimensional structure, which we use all the time. These are our routine languages. In written languages, the sequence is in space. In spoken languages, the sequence is in time. That's fine, but the order represents a certain structure, and we use it implicitly or explicitly in extracting the meaning out of whatever the structure is conveying. But you don't have to stop there. You can go further. You can have two-dimensional structures. They are combinations of multiple ordered sequences. What can they do? That the information can actually reside in the correlation among the sequences without being present in any individual sequence. And this is a fancy description, but we are very familiar with that's what our eyes and ears do anyway. We can respond when somebody calls out our name. We are able to turn our head and look in that direction. Where did that information about direction came? Well, the ears detected slightly differing signal. We did some analysis, parallax removal, and then brain did that job, and then we were able to tell that yes, the signal came from that direction. So this is the information which is not in an individual signal, but in the correlations. And if you can extract it, well, you can make use of it. And it can convey useful things. And the people who have exploited this tremendously are the astronomers. They detect all kinds of distant objects which we can't see with our eyes or even with a single telescopes by doing large-scale baseline interferometry. What does it mean? It's not one detector, but it's a set of detectors spread over large regions. And by combining the signal observed at various places, we're able to see much farther away than what we are able to see with an individual line of sight. And the most recent example of that was the detection of gravitational waves. There was no hope of detecting it with just a single signal, but fancy technologies were developed. And finally, there were 2 detectors in the US which detected the waves. Not only they confirmed each other, but before there were 2 detectors, they were say it came from that direction. So this is a non-trivial feature. And what is buried inside this correlation? It is a wave dynamics. If there are individual particles coming from each other, we would not have been able to figure out how to add them. But these are actually wave signals. And we can combine them, the usual dynamics of interference. We'll cancel out some things which we don't want, which will enhance something which we want. And then you can study that, extract it, and make use of it. So waves are playing a crucial role here also. In superposition, of course, they are there. Interference, of course, waves are playing a role. And then we can continue this story as far as we can go. 3-dimensional structures, well, the biomolecules all work by these mechanisms. They all have distinctive structure, and that is the way they are identified and they carry out their particular task in all the living cells. They are all lock and key mechanisms in the language of molecular biology. And 4-dimensional is the maximal thing which we can handle and which is buried inside our global positioning system. It can tell you both space and time, precisely all the coordinates that are needed to specify any event in the universe. We don't even have to stop there. We can have degrees of freedom which can simultaneously exploit multiple dimensionalities. And this is a peculiar feature, but it is possible in our physical world. And the domain of quantum computers and quantum information happens to be a case where both 0 and 1-dimensional information is present simultaneously. There is superposition and there is a tensor product. Both are there, and that combination gives it an extra power which either of the individual components could not have given them. Proteins are a more non-trivial example, combines features of both 1 and 3-dimensional information, and although we know they work, we really don't know how the information is coded and how it accomplishes its task. It's an unsolved problem. And to summarize it, there are different features of particles and waves. Particles are discrete objects. You can count, you can order them, you can specify the number, shape, structure, etc. Waves will allow you to do superposition, interference, parallax, some differential analysis, things like that. And both of them can be present in a system like quantum theory. Okay, so that was about just the type of collections. What are the building blocks? What you can choose from them? This will require a description of physical properties, and which has to be discrete in the sense of distinguishability. And they are, as I said, labeled by groups. So 1-dimensional structure, I said I'm going to look at minimal languages. So in 1-dimensional, the group with the smallest number of elements is actually just 2 elements. We call this Z2. It's a binary language, and it can be extended to a d-dimensional situation by just doing a Cartesian product. That's fine, and it's a general purpose language for constructing these sequences of letters. Two-dimensional, the structure will become a triangle. It's useful not for our one-dimensional word processors, but if you want to describe, say, pictures on a screen or even videos, you typically end up doing what is called a triangulation, or actually it's a dual form is hexagonal, but that is a convenient way to summarize the information buried inside two-dimensional objects, and some examples of that are also being used in lithography, which is a high-level technology to draw specific circuits in two-dimensional silicon chips. Three-dimensional, the simplex is a tetrahedron, and it's a dual form in terms of group representation is what chemists called sp3 hybridization. The smallest two representations, L equal to 0 and L equal to 1. And the geometry it produces is that of carbon and a diamond lattice, and the machinery which has used this thing very effectively is actually molecular biology, where they use all kinds of molecules based on the tetrahedral geometry of carbon to do all kinds of non-trivial metabolic tasks. There's one more group which is a small group and which is found to be useful, which is SU2, somewhat related to this three-dimensional orthogonal group. It again has this four basic set of numbers or directions, identity, and the three polymatrices, the smallest two representations in some sense, and we express everything of the quantum information in this particular basis. Larger groups can be used, they have been used in error correcting codes and cryptography, but not in terms of coding information at the simplest scales. If you want to make life complicated, then you go to doing this, and this is more of a topic of hiding information rather than revealing information. Okay, and then the next part of the group machinery is selected these building blocks. What are you going to do in terms of processing with it? And that depends on the dimensionality. If you have a zero-dimensional structure, which I said it's a superposition, the only thing you can do with that is add. That's the only operation available, nothing more. It's commutative and produces interference structures. In one-dimensional, the structure Z2 is a field. It allows two operations, addition and multiplication, and we do all our arithmetic with that. Then you go further, and in higher dimension, you have more. Addition generalizes to translation, multiplication to a scale change, but there are new operations which are rotations that appear as well. The rotations even become non-commutative for dimensionality larger than true, and the algebra generated by this lattice transformation actually is much more powerful than common arithmetic, provided you can make use of it. And so more things become possible. What structure you choose depends on what is available as well as what you are trying to do. So now let me get on to the business of quantum computers. The subject got motivation from two different directions. One was a sort of inevitability that the technology is shrinking the size of elementary components, and sooner or later we are going to hit the atomic scale. We have already reached the nanoscale in a certain sense. And then what are you going to do with those components at that particular scales? And we are forced to think about the rules available at that particular scales, and they are defined by the quantum mechanical machinery. The other thing which was not expected is that this jump happens to be a breakthrough in a sense that quantum algorithms are somehow better in accomplishing certain computational tasks than the classical counterparts. And that is because they have more ingredients buried inside the machinery than what the classical information has. And as I already said, that additional ingredient is a simultaneous presence of particle and wave feature of the dynamics. The particle feature is what we call the classical dynamics of the Boolean algebra, but you are adding something extra, and that is going to provide with you new directions which were not originally available. And yeah, this I already said. The wave variables are in some sense like the analog computers that we have forgotten about, but if you can exploit them, they can do non-trivial things much more easily, like differentiation and integrations, the operations of calculus. We have to literally stand on our heads to do that with Boolean logic. And well, that is a direction which needs exploration. It's not that we are unfamiliar with waves. We have dealt with waves all the time. Even in the electric circuits, there are the RLC circuits which are used in a certain sense for these analog computers, but we basically have left them out in the digital language altogether. Maybe you should go and look at the features of what extra can be obtained by putting these things back in. And one word which keeps on appearing, what happens when you combine particle and waves, is we get what is called entanglement, and I will give the mathematical description of it soon enough. So this is the basics of the quantum language. We use the smallest group, which is a set of two states manipulated by the algebra of SU2, the spatial unitary group in 2 dimensions. The vectors are some linear combination of 0 and 1. We can have superposition, which is buried inside this coefficient alpha and beta, and a generic register will be constructed by putting many of these bits together and putting some superposition coefficients in front. So this structure has buried inside several things I said. This sequence of letters I1, I2, In, that is a tensor product structure which came from the one-dimensional information part. This summation over here, it's a superposition. It came from the superposition or the zero-dimensional structure of the information, and we have both of them together, and when there is a tensor product as well as the summation, the state which is produced, we call it an entangled state. So entanglement is nothing but simultaneous presence of zero-dimensional and one-dimensional structure. If either one of them is absent, we will not call it entanglement. So you don't have to really worry about separate meaning for entanglement if you can understand this decomposition. And what is a generic description? You are going to take this kind of states, and then you apply a general transformation. It happens to be a unitary transformation or a rotation in this large Hilbert space, and that will provide the dynamics. And then at the end, you are going to construct some output, and that output is going to be a projection that is the consequence of the superposition language. You may have multiple signals sitting inside there, but you can listen to only one of them at a time. You can choose, but it will get one particular component out, and there is a rule of how often you will get that one component out that is given by Bond's prescription, so basically modulo square of the amplitude that particular direction. And these are the two operations which are used to manipulate information sitting inside this particular state, and that constructs the computer. There's nothing more than that involved. But this feature is highly non-trivial, and it does very simple, unusual looking tasks, and I will illustrate them. There are basic ingredients used to illustrate them, and one simple component is this 2-qubit object, which is called a Bell state. It's an entangled state. There are 2 qubits, but you cannot factor them into several parts, and these two things are superposed in a peculiar way. And if you look at only one of them, they carry no information in the sense that you will get 0 and 1 with equal probability. But if you look at the two things jointly, then they are perfectly correlated in the sense that the values of the 2 bits are identical in this particular superposition. One of them is 0, the other is also 0. One of them is 1, the other is also 1. And so this Bell state contains information not in its individual parts, but in the correlations. And that fact can be exploited to display very unusual features. One example is what is called a dense coding. You are given this particular Bell state, and then the question is, can you use that state to communicate information? The answer is yes, and the question is then how much information you can communicate. So I can explain this little more detail. These are so-called basis vectors in the 2-dimensional space, and one is a psi plus and minus symmetric and antisymmetric components of this 0, 0 and 1, 1. And the other one is similar combination, but made from so these make up 4 states. There are 2 bits, so there are 4 basis vectors, and so this forms a complete set. Not only it is a complete set, it's a fully orthogonal set. So it's a new set of orthogonal directions, and so they can convey separate meanings. So how is this dense coding accomplished? So the Bell state is given, and then you send 1 qubit to one party and another qubit to another party while maintaining the correlation between the two. So this is a pre-existing resource. And then how does the communication take place? That one party will now perform one of these 4 operations. Identity, X is a sigma X polymatrix, Z is a sigma Z polymatrix, and this is a product of these two. So either of these 4 operations are carried out, and what happens under this operation? Of course, identity means that the psi minus will remain psi minus, but if you apply X only on the first bit, so it is this particular state, but X is a off-diagonal matrix and Z is a diagonal polymatrix. So when you apply X 0 will become 1 and 1 will become 0. So from this state, you flip one of them, but don't flip the other one, and you will end up going into this second state. So psi will convert to phi under x, and the sign of whatever it is, it will be retained. On the other hand, if I apply z to one of these states, this relative sign will get flipped because one of them has 1 and the other one has a 0 in that location. So it will flip between plus and minus combinations. So in this case, when I apply I will get psi minus. When I apply x, I will get phi minus. If I apply z, I will get psi plus. And when I apply both of them together, I will get phi plus. So now the communication task is that there are two parties. Say the first one applied one of these 4 operations. It changed the states, and whatever qubit was there now was sent across some communication channel to the other end. And then the second party now have both the qubits together. These 4 combinations are the possibilities, but they are orthogonal combinations, and so they can be perfectly distinguished by making measurement. So the second party will make a measurement, decide which of the 4 possibilities are present, and depending on the answer, can unambiguously state which of the 4 operations was applied by the first party. So what was transmitted, initially there was a Bell state resource, that is a background. Transmission was that of only 1 qubit, and 1 qubit was able to convey the information about 4 distinct possibilities. So this is the phenomena which has been labeled dense coding, because 1 qubit conveys information about 4 possibilities. Not possible with Boolean logic, but here it can be done. There is an inverse process which has a more fancy name. It's called teleportation. And it starts with a similar situation, that a Bell state exists as a resource spread over 2 locations. But then the task is different, that there is some unknown state alpha, and the job is to send this alpha to the other side, not physically, but in terms of some communication signal. And alpha is a complicated combination. It actually is a qubit state, so it has 2 complex numbers worth of information. Those complex numbers are not integers. They could have arbitrary precision, so it could be a very complicated task if you want to do it classically. But can we do it quantum mechanically in an easy way? The answer is yes. And what is done is, on one side there is this alpha and half Bell state. The other side has the other half of the Bell state. And then what you do is send classical signals. Which are actually 2 bits, either 0 and 1, this specifying 4 possibilities. And the end result is peculiar in the sense that nothing physically of these 2 things go over there. But what you end up having is a Bell state here and alpha there. So mysteriously, this, whatever the complex numbers, complicated stuff was over here, gets reproduced over there by sending only 2 bits. These are all real numbers with arbitrary precision doesn't matter, and that is called teleportation. Physically, nothing is transported here. What is sending is these 2 bits of information, which are precisely these 4 possibilities. Either you call it this or you call it that. And how does that happen? That is possible because of this simple looking identity. That this is a 1-bit signal, this is a 2-bit Bell state. You can rewrite it as a Bell state combination in this particular way, but that will involve a complicated combination. Because it's a complete basis, this is always possible because any 2 bits can be rewritten as some coefficients of psi minus psi plus this. So just a decomposition in terms of complete basis vectors. And then what is left over on the other side is either alpha or x times alpha or z times alpha or zx times alpha. And then what has to be communicated is this label. Distinguishes whether it is identity or x or z of x. There are only 4 different possibilities, and that is what is communicated by measuring this combination which is sitting inside here. So this is actually a Bell state prime. It's not just the original singlet one. It could be either of the 4. You measure it, and if you get psi minus, you tell that the other fellow that you don't have to do anything. You measure phi minus, then say the other side, you apply x, psi plus, you apply z, and phi plus, you apply z times x. So it's a very trivial task, and well, there's an exercise to prove it, but well, I can show it for a brute force technique. That let me say that this is alpha is say A0 plus B1, and the psi minus initially is 0, 0 minus 1, 1 by root 2. So this is the left-hand side of the equation. It's actually easier to take at the right-hand side and match it term by term. Simplify, there will be some cancellations and additions, whatever it is between these two. So this is and right-hand side I will write only the corresponding component. Say I want the coefficient of 3 zeros. So 3 zeros will occur inside these terms or not. Well, sometimes it does. So in the first term it is 0, 0. That's the only part which will contribute. And alpha has this A times 0. That is fine. That's the only thing which will come from the first part. We'll see the phi minus has anything which is equal to 2 zeros. The answer is no. Psi plus has anything with 2 zeros. Yes, the answer is yes, which is again and then I need a term with the third thing also equal to 0, which happens to be the psi plus state, which is actually I can write the full thing as well, but it will cancel out. Let me show that as well. So this is, so this will, what is come from psi plus, this phi plus does not have 2 zeros at the beginning either. So this is the only term with this first term equal to 2 zeros. I add them, this stuff cancels, and then the result is basically the same. This is A times 0, 0, 0 by root 2 and multiplied by 2. And in the identity, there was a half on the other side, which will cancel this extra half. So this is a mathematical identity, but it is able to send information contained in these two complex numbers by sending 2 bits of classical numbers, and there is no conflict with any physical principles. So this is called teleportation. So there is more power in the quantum machinery than what we'll naively think of in Boolean logic. There is no way you can send a real number by using 2 bits in any classical scheme. And here the life is even more complicated than that. So there are things one can do. And mathematically, yeah, this can be proved, but what I'm trying to stress is there are the physical underpinnings of this phenomena. And this is a structure which I mentioned indirectly, but I can make it mathematically more precise. It is something which is called super additivity in the context of communication. That more information can be sent through a n-channel system used once than a single channel used n times. So the joint use of n channels actually can tell you more than each one them one by one. And it's a super additive structure. And how does that happen? That is because this joint use allowed you to convey correlations, which the individual uses will not be allowed to do. And this extra channel capacity is present in this wave dynamics, which went through it. Interference experiments and these telescopes exploit this, but it has a non-trivial result when you again try to express it in terms of information. Just like here, you could send a real number by using a 2-bit integer. You are doing something non-trivial, that you can have channels, individual capacity is 0. It's so noisy that nothing goes through. But if you combine them, the combined system can have a non-zero communication rate. Sounds counterintuitive, but the fact that it is true. The signal and noise can be separated when they have different correlation scales. Noise may be, lot of noise may be there, but if the correlation scale of the signal is different than that of the noise, you can filter it out. And our telescopes do this. This light scale baseline interferometry basically does that. Digs out signal, there is a lot of noise, but you pull it out. And so it has this unusual statement in the language of channel capacity, that you can have 0 capacity channels combined together to give a non-zero communication rate. The information is between the channels, it's in the correlated part of the signal.
Because the Hilbert space is larger than
Yeah, the space is larger. It's you have to work with the full tensor product instead of just the block diagonal structure of the transmission matrix.
in the case of 2 channels, 4.
Yeah, so if you want to express it as a transmission matrix, suppose I have a binary channel, okay? So if I have used 2 channels individually, what I convey is what is inside here and what is inside there. But if I use them jointly, I convey something non-trivial here also. And that is the correlation part of the signal. There is an upper bound of how much you can send, but the fact that it is more than what you can send by just using this. And technological important part is our cell phones have already moved in these particular directions. Hardware has been tested. It may not be in your pocket yet, but they will start having multiple receiving antennas in the same little box. And that will help in cutting down the noise of the transmission. Right now, the electromagnetic bandwidth is kind of getting saturated. There is too much noise on the receiving side, what you can hear, and the signal keeps on dropping and all things like that. We are trying to clean it up. With this extra capacity, it will come when you have multiple antennas sitting on the same cell phone device. So this is peculiar, but there is nothing mathematically wrong with it. It's just that our language, when we write it in a different way, it might look a little bit surprising. And that is a jump which is not so obvious when you try to write the information or the entropy in this sort of mathematical form. There is a Shannon form used in a Boolean algebra all the time. It's a pi log pi, and there is a von Neumann form which uses a density matrix rho log rho. If both of these things are diagonal only, then there is actually no difference, but this density matrix has some off-diagonal structure, and if you use it, it will contribute something, and you have to then do the mathematics to figure out how much can be extracted. There are restrictions on the density matrix also. It cannot be arbitrarily large. They have to define the constraint of a pure state, for example, rho square equal to rho and things like that. But these examples actually tell you that there is no real way to compare a bit and a qubit as some unit of information. I cannot say that 1 qubit is equal to so many bits. Not possible. And it's like apples and oranges. We may want to call both of them fruits, but there is no real way to compare them. So how do we compare? And it goes back to the context which you have to put in, that you don't compare a bit and a qubit directly, but to compare what you can do with a bit and a qubit. And that requires that you specify the boundaries. What is the input and what is the output? You want to perform a particular task from a certain input to a certain output. And the tasks we have are always expressed in classical language. We haven't yet figured out how to define a quantum task. Okay, our problems are all classical. We can write down on a piece of paper or give a mathematical formula for it. That's all classical language. So we have a classical problem, and then you can say that I want to solve this classical problem either by a classical route, Boolean logic, or by a quantum route. And that I can compare. How much resources are needed, how much effort will be required in individual steps, etc., etc. So you don't compare abstract quantity like a bit or a qubit, but you compare the resources needed for the same task in two different realizations. And that is the situation in which we look at quantum information, and then these examples tell you that they do some things better than our classical machinery can do. And here are the famous theorems of Shannon. What happens to them in this language? There is a first theorem is a data compression. It says that you have a certain amount of data, and not all of them is useful. A lot of redundancy and noise inside it. We can basically throw it out and reduce the size of the data. We do it frequently on our computer, compress all the files. And that is dictated by how much information is really present in the data. So you need a measure of this, and Shannon proved it that this quantity really gives the limit of how much compression is possible, and it can be shown in the quantum case that the analogous quantity is this von Neumann entropy. So this variable does carry, or the shift does carry the data compression part correctly, but the second theorem of Shannon, which specified channel capacity, it does not apply to quantum case. The same function also distinguished how much noise you can tolerate in communications. And that is, sometimes the first one is called the noiseless coding theorem, and this is called the noisy coding theorem, whatever it is, a different terminology. But in this case, because of features like this superadditivity business, the channel capacity doesn't behave the same way even if you try to define it using von Neumann entropy. There are peculiar features, it is not the same, and nobody has actually found so far a proper generalization of Shannon's theorem about what can be done with a quantum communication channel. With a specific task, yes, but in general, there is no global answer. What happened? Yeah. Okay. I still have some time, yeah. So now let me go to a little bit of a different problem, not the communication problems of this sort, but where we try to measure something or get some non-trivial result out. And there is one particular model which has only one qubit, nothing more than that, and it's called labeled as DQC1. And the purpose of this construction was basically academic, but it showed that even one qubit can do things much more usefully than whatever classical computers can do. Rather peculiar because it doesn't even use the concept of entanglement at all. So algebra is rather simple. You start with one qubit, but it becomes the control part, which is written here as identity plus some alpha times x. That is its density matrix. And all the others are in a fully mixed state. So this is the initial state. Mixed state is an identity operation. And then you apply a certain operation, which is called a control operation. The first qubit controls the matrix or the operator U, which will be applied to the second part. And this is a definition of, if 0 is there, control U doesn't do anything, and if it is 1 is there, the control U operation is applied. So if you do this transformation, rho will go to this control U, rho control U dagger, to do a little bit matrix multiplication. The identity part doesn't do anything, but the off diagonal one get affected by control, and U dagger and U end up on the off diagonal. So this is the final state. And then the job is to find out some property, this operator U, which was given as some kind of a black box operation. You want to find out what happened. And if you perform a measurement on this final density matrix, you can measure any of these off-diagonal polymatrices, X or Y, it will give either the real part of the trace of this matrix or the imaginary part of the trace of the matrix. It's a rather simple exercise, but you can do it. So you can apply this control operation, and then you can measure this answer, which will give you the trace of U, both the real and the imaginary part. Now the funny thing is that there exist matrices which are 2 raised to n times 2 raised to n. These are these n-bit matrices. That un can be constructed by a set of simple operations which are polynomial in the number n. But the trace of u cannot be computed by any known classical algorithm which is polynomial in n. Remember, n, this u is a 2 raised to n times 2 raised to n matrix, so the trace will have 2 raised to n terms. You can have situations where you can construct u easily, but you can't measure the final output easily. On the other hand, this object will be measured rather directly by just a single measurement of a single qubit. It's just the expectation value of the first bit. It will give you x, the polymetrics x or y. So 1 qubit measurement will give you a trace, and the trace here it is not even expressible, is a polynomial in this number n, which can be as large as you wish. So this 1 qubit model in some sense is more powerful than a classical counterpart. There is no simple way n can become as large as you want to extract the trace of this matrix. While the quantum part you are measuring just a single qubit, some expectation value. So this is a unusual illustration, but it says that you get non-trivial things by just this extra mathematical structure of superposition and tensor product. In this particular case, the situation is such that there is no entanglement present in the initial state as well. The initial state is completely factorized. There is no correlation here, unless in these situations where the initial state had a Bell pair as a resources, here the entanglement was not even there, still you are able to do non-trivial things. Yes?
So you have to do repeatedly.
Yes. If you want to increase the precision of this, you have to measure these things many times, and then the accuracy will go according to the central limit theorem.
So you never get an exact.
You never get an exact answer. You get a what you call error answer with a certain error. The error can be made smaller and smaller depending on how many trials you want to take.
But is it possible that there are classical probabilistic algorithms that achieve this?
No, even a classical probabilistic algorithm which is polynomial in n is not known.
You're saying with the number of measurements we're going to do is going to be polynomial?
No, because these are single qubit measurement, so the answer is only individual trial you will get 0 and 1, nothing more than that.
Yeah.
And how many trials you need to take will depend on the mean value, which is this trace of un. That depends how frequently you will get 0 and how frequently you will get 1. But the error is not really dictated by the mean. It's dictated by the central limit theorem. You can create various mathematically precise statements like Chernoff bound about how fast the answer will converge to the average value in terms of the number of trials. But there is no classical analog of such a procedure available in this particular example. So, this is it's a cooked up example. It's just for academic curiosity, but it illustrates that even with 1 qubit, you might be doing something non-trivial, which is not so easily doable in classical logic. And second example, which is more visible and in terms of the language as used initially, that is of particle and waves, illustrates that interference actually can simplify certain tasks. And the example is something which is called a Grover's algorithm. I'm going to describe it as using the language of waves. That is not in the original language in which Grover wrote down. He wrote down as a quantum computing task. But the problem is basically what is called a database search. There are a set of objects. You know a particular property that I want, an object which has this particular property, but I have no idea about the arrangement of the objects. They are sort of random. They are all thrown all over the place, and I have to pick the one which has the right property. And classically, there is no easy way to do it except go through the thing one by one. If you assume certain structure, then yes, I arrange the properties in some increasing or decreasing order, then I can do a binary search. That is either larger or smaller, and that can simplify the task. But Grover's algorithm corresponds to a situation where I have no information about the property at all. And in that particular case, there is a dynamics of waves which can be used to simplify the problem, which can do the job in square root n number of operations instead of n operations. And that is the structure which I will illustrate by this simple example. So this is again a minimal task. Suppose I am allowed to query or look for the property only once. How many objects can I distinguish? And the example of Grover's algorithm says that I can distinguish 4 objects by asking one binary question. The classical answer is 2. I have a binary question, I can sort out only 2. But this quantum superposition, or rather the wave dynamics, says that no, I can distinguish 4. How does it work? You start with the original state, which is a superposition. There are 4 amplitudes. I have no knowledge, make them unbiased, all equal. Then I am allowed to ask one question, which is implemented by flipping the sign of the amplitude with the correct property. So in this particular illustration, the first object has a property which I want. I ask the oracle or the binary question, and it will flip the sign. Flipping the sign is a binary operation. And that will convert this all initial values of half to 1 minus half and the other 3 plus half. Well, the normalization convention for this unitary states is the sum of the squares of all the amplitude is equal to 1. So there are 4 states, the amplitude is half. And after asking that binary question, what do? Nothing, just wait. And that waiting period exploits the dynamics of waves. What will a wave do when you perturb it from its equilibrium state? It will oscillate about that mean value. So initial state was an equilibrium. All things was steady, but I provided a kick by asking this binary question. And now it's going to oscillate. The mean is now shifted. It is somewhere over here. And I wait for half an oscillation period. So the amplitude goes from one side of the equilibrium value to the other side. And then what is minus half here, average is quarter, it becomes plus 1, and this was plus half, average is quarter, they all become 0. And the algorithm says, after half an oscillation period, stop. And then the state which is left over here is exactly the state which responded to the binary question. But it has sorted out 4 possibilities by one binary question. So this is a power which came from the dynamics of waves. I've not used anything else. The example, as I said, Grover found out while studying quantum algorithms, and nobody had discovered it in the language of waves, essentially because we are not thinking in the language of waves. Let me just put it that way. But computational tasks were all thought of in terms of these discrete binary processes. If we had thought about waves, we could have discovered this thing doing in an unusual way. And it's an illustration that you did something which was not possible by one binary question and the classical logic, but now you are able to do it using wave dynamics in an interference experiment. And it's true that you needed 4 amplitudes over here. If you want to realize it in the tabletop experiment, you will need 4 different oscillators or 4 normal modes interfering with each other. But in quantum case, we can put them all on the same object. And so they get compressed, and the normal modes of 4 normal modes actually can be realized with 2 qubits. And that is the language in which Grover's algorithm is implemented and also tested in quantum hardware. So these are the examples which I would like to mention. Yeah, I think this is a place to stop. The lesson I want to convey is that we have not exploited, or rather looked at information theory in a broader context. And information, when looked upon in terms of these multiple different aspects, cannot be just quantified in terms of one number. Whether it is von Neumann entropy or Shannon entropy or Boltzmann entropy, it is just one number. It just counts the number of possibilities. The information is not just that one particular number. If you want to figure out what all things are possible and what are the limits of what we can do, you should look at more variables. In the language of physics, these extra variables are various kind of correlations. And you must understand those correlations, how to quantify them, and how to define mathematical measures from them if you really want to study information theory in more generality. Simple steps have been taken, like mutual information is a correlation between 2 parts. There can be more complicated correlations than that as well, but that's a beginning. You can define mutual information. It's a binary correlation. It tells you some features about the dynamics of the system. There are classical expressions. The quantum expressions are slightly different. The values which are allowed are again a little bit different between classical and quantum case. But if you want to study more, you probably need to define more general type of correlations and figure out what all kind of information is conveyed by those kind of correlations. It is an open problem, and my purpose of going through all this rigmarole was to tell you that sometimes it is worthwhile to think out of the box. Don't close yourself into a certain mathematical framework. There are new possibilities. And if you look at them, maybe you will understand something new. And thank you very much. And yeah, one thing I can say, this model, just for the sake of curiosity, I made a physical model, tabletop experiment, high school science project of 4 masses vibrating on 4 different springs and showing how this transfer of amplitude occurs. It's there on my computer and I can play it if there are some people interested in looking at it, but it's nothing fancy. And the interesting part is that the meaning completely changes depending on the realization. In quantum mechanics, these things are called probability amplitudes. So if you measure them, it tells you the probability of being this state or that state, etc. But if you make a mechanical model like vibration, the square of the amplitude is giving you the energy. It's not probability. And then what is happening here is you are transferring energy from one place to another. It can have widely different applications. It's not a useless task for engineering purposes. But you can use it to either to focus energy or to dissipate energy, depending on whether you run it forward or backward. And both directions are technologically very important. And what this algorithm tells you is this is the best you can do given the physical laws. How fast you can concentrate energy or how fast you can dissipate energy. So that's it. Thank you. The 4 coupled oscillators, they're coupled through the bar on the top. They have a common base. And the 4 initial state is where all of them 4 are starting out together. And then the oracle is a reflection where one of these velocities or momentum of the oscillator is reversed. But that is the one which is easily implemented. I can't reverse the position, but reflection momentum is fine. And then what you have to see for is, or rather imagine this thing in a momentum space. So there will come a stage where all the other 3 are stationary and one of them is moving very fast. That is the transfer of the amplitude in momentum space. So it was to start at the beginning again. Okay, let me see. I'll play it again. It's okay. So initial state are all together, then one of them is bounced off, and then you can see at some stage there will be a place where one of them is moving very fast, the other ones are more or less stationary. And that is what has happened, and it's a cyclic process, so it repeats. But there is essentially a transfer of the energy or the amplitude between the 4 oscillators through a common base at the top. And this is the high school experiment for a science project, whatever it is. And all it is there is just dynamics of coupled modes, nothing more than that.